Hi, good morning, everyone. Welcome to a very special grand rounds this morning. I'm just thrilled to have Dr. Chandrashekhar here this morning. He and I had the privilege of working together years ago at the VA hospital, or at the Hennepin County Medical Center, and now I get to see him as in his role as the editor-in-chief of JACC Imaging, and it's just a wonderful to see his career flourish like this. And I want to thank at first Bristol Myers Squibb and United Therapeutics for sponsoring us this morning. Let me just tell you a little bit for those of us that have had rejection letters from JACC. This is our morning to learn and hopefully improve on our return that way. Dr. Chandrashekhar is a professor of medicine at the University of Minnesota, and he is the chair of cardiology at the VA Medical Center as well. And since 2017, he has been the editor-in-chief of JACC Imaging. I'm told by sources that are well informed that JACC Imaging is the top ranked by impact factor of all the imaging journals in the world. And that's a testament to your shepherding of that journal. He also told me this morning that they get about 2,000 manuscripts per year. That's about 40 manuscripts per week, and he personally looks at every one of them. So an interesting job that you have there. He's also exceptionally clinician, has gotten a Teacher of the Year award from the fellows many times, and his imaging work and interests right now are in MRI, although he has done a lot of basic science work in myocardial infarction in animal models. Dr. Chandrashekhar hails from Pune, India, which is about 100 miles from Mumbai and on the western side of India. And now he lives in Edina. And we are so thrilled to have you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Dr. Sharkey. Dr. Sharkey forgot to tell you that he was one of my teachers at Hennepin, and very rigorous taskmaster, and I really enjoyed working with him, learning hemodynamics from him. Good morning. It's a great pleasure to be here. I have some old friends here, and I get great delight in reading the excellent papers that come out from your group. And I'm always amazed at how you can balance a very heavy clinical load with a very robust publication record at MHI. So thank you for inviting me. Let's talk about, it's an unusual grand round, I'm sure, but it's an important topic in the sense research is a very important aspect of what we all do. And sometimes it appears that there's this mysterious thing happening, and then a letter comes out and says it's rejected or accepted. I just want to take you behind the workings of this, tell you about how journals work, especially how JACC imaging works, and how we make these decisions which often seem to be capricious, but there is a method to the madness. Okay, so let's start with the publishing landscape. I'll talk mainly about my area of research and interest, that's imaging, but I'm sure it's the same with intervention, it's the same with any other field. So it's a pretty crowded field. So you would be surprised, at least in imaging, which is a smaller field compared to many other specialties. There are 133 journals which deal with imaging either through cardiology, radiology, or nuclear imaging. And you probably had heard some of these names. And so this is the milieu in which you guys compete and we compete to get your papers. There are also now general medical journals and journals like the Nature family which are getting into this. And a lot of their work is based on imaging related topics. So it makes an interesting issue for the authors. How do you choose your journals? And here is a publication from the Nature group when they surveyed a few thousand authors to see what is it that an author looks in a journal before he submits to them. And the 4 common things were listed here, right? So let's look at it in a little greater detail. Relevance of journal content, journal's reputation, and there's some controversy on how do you determine the reputation of a journal. We'll talk a little about that. The quality of peer review. You as an author have worked hard and expect a very respectful and a scholarly peer review. And then, of course, the journal impact factor. We'll talk a little more about that also. So one of the few things in a publishing strategy for an author is which journal, why, and how to get there, right? So what do we know about journals' reputation and operation? And this is something you should know before you send a paper to a journal. The commonest index that we look at is impact factor. And here are the 3 multimodality imaging journals that compete in this space. JACC imaging in the golden color, Circ imaging in green, European Heart Journal Cardiovascular imaging in pink. And here is the impact factor across the last decade. And you will see that there's till about 2016 or so, they were kind of bunched together. But in the last 5 years, we were lucky to really attract very good papers from groups like yours. And so right now, the JACC imaging impact factor is nearly twice the impact factor of its nearest journal, and we are probably the highest cited impact journal in this field. The impact factor just tells you one aspect of publication, and often it's not a very good measure because it tells you the journal is attracting good papers, but it doesn't tell you how many papers make up that number. It could be that 90% of your papers don't get cited and a few winners make it look good. What you need to look is how consistent this impact factor trend is, and what is it that's determining the impact factor. So as you know, the impact factor is a numerator and a denominator. The numerator is the number of citations in the last 2 years for a paper published in a given year, divided by the total number of papers you publish. So the idea is if your papers are getting cited a lot, you're a better journal. But unfortunately, some editors have tried to game it by reducing the denominator so you get a higher impact factor. So it's important for you to see that also. And here are the citable items, which is the denominator. And as you can see, JACC imaging is consistently increasing its denominator, which is like usually a suicide for an editor-in-chief. But we were lucky enough to attract sufficient quality of papers so that we could continue publishing. And since I took over in 2016, I have doubled the amount of papers I publish. So essentially, that's good. If authors have good science, it's naturally my duty to make sure that we can showcase it. So that's a plug for my journal. If you guys want to send it to JACC Imaging, we publish twice the number of papers as any of our competitors. Look at one of the other journals. They have decided to go the other route. They have consistently reduced their denominator, which in one sense props up the impact factor, but it makes it difficult for the author to get in there, right? All these journals are tough to get in. My acceptance rate is in the range of 5 to 6%. I've tried hard to increase it. So the last count, we were at 8%. And it took a lot of effort. I had to double the issue size to get to 8%. The other journals are in the 12, 15% range. They are also very selective journals. So it's a tough field to get in. And then lastly, you should also look at various metrics of how impactful papers are, not impact factor, but how do they compare, like source normalize. If you normalize across different fields, some journals publish more in one field than the other. How could you normalize that? And here is one index. And the one in blue is JACC imaging, and we are consistently publishing much higher quality papers than any of our competitors. And over the last 3 years, their numbers have gone down. So thank you again. It's an honor to be able to showcase such good papers. The other thing you need to look at is journal consistency, right? So here is an example of what I mean. There's a thing called a 5-year impact factor instead of having a 1-year flash. And like, for example, here you can see one journal that year had a guideline which gave them 1,000 citations, and so they just jumped high. And after that guideline dropped off, the impact factor came down. So it's important to see the consistency of a journal. And one measure is the 5-year impact factor. And here you can see in 2016, if I represent this, the diameter of this circle as the impact factor at the 5-year impact factor when we started. This is JACC imaging, Circ imaging, and European Heart Journal imaging here. And then in the next 5 years, this is what happened. JACC imaging doubled its 5-year impact factor, whereas our competitors were not as successful. They were improving, but not as successful. The other thing you need to see is the article influence score, and I think you see a similar pattern there: JACC imaging, Circ imaging, European Heart imaging. And then lastly, when you publish something, you want other people to pick it up right away. You don't want that paper to languish immediately, and there is an index for that called, just like there's an app for that, there's an index for that, and that's called article immediacy score. And there also you can see that some journal articles are picked up immediately compared to other journal articles. Whether they are picked up in the press or picked up by other authors citing that becomes important. The other choice that you have often is specialized versus generalist journals. Lots of general cardiology journals also get into the imaging space. And one particular journal is perhaps the newer journal is JAMA Cardiology, which also publishes a lot of imaging papers. And compared to that, JACC imaging has done reasonably well. These are the impact factors for JACC imaging. This is the impact factor for JAMA Cardiology. And as you can see, last year we were ahead of JAMA Cardiology. And then our JCI is a score that normalizes different fields, because a general cardiology journal cannot be compared with an imaging journal so easily. And so this kind of a metric tells us, and even in that, our papers were doing much better than JAMA Cardiology, which is a very storied journal. So the reason to show this slide is not to say how these two journals are comparing, but what I'm saying is if you have an imaging paper and you're thinking about a journalist journal, you also have equally good options in the specialized imaging field. The other thing you need to know is how will your work be showcased, right? When you publish something nowadays, you want it on social media, you want it to be amplified, and here is what's happening in downloads. So unfortunately for the JACC family of journals, our online portfolio is split into two parts. There is a thing called Science Direct, which is run by the publisher, the Elsevier, and then JACC.org is our own family. In a way, it's a strength and also a weakness, so because our downloads get split up. And here I've shown you the downloads from Science Direct. We had 1.2 million downloads last year for JACC imaging articles from Science Direct, and an equal amount at JACC.org. So roughly in the 2.2, 2.3 million range, papers were downloaded from JACC imaging. And then, of course, Twitter mentions and altmetrics have consistently gone up. So this shows that if you publish in a journal like JACC imaging, you have good exposure and people pick it up. What does an editor do? So let's go back and see. There's a little difference between the literary editor and the scientific journal. So there used to be a very legendary editor who helped a lot of Nobel laureates publish their work, and that was Max Perkins. And he was supposed to be like their money lender, their marriage counselor, psychoanalyst, and a lot of other things. You don't want us to be doing that. That will be a disaster. But nevertheless, this doesn't work in medicine. And the reason is there's an excess supply of papers and there is a paucity of time. And so the basic underlying thing is authors need to come up with a reason for editors to feel warm about their project, and then the authors will work with you. So essentially, I as an editor-in-chief have two major responsibilities to the journal. I want to promote the best scholarship and advanced science, and then I want my journal to be top notch, right? So that's, but then I have other responsibilities also to the society, to the readership, to the public trust. So which is also in the back of our minds when we look at a paper. And then of course there is a smaller thing in the back, that's the organizational policies and business models. Thankfully, at least in the Jack family, we don't get exposed to any of these pressures, so that's a good thing. So author-editor interactions. You would be surprised, at least this is the philosophy at Jack Imaging. It's not an antagonistic kind of a relationship. So essentially what we think is the authors have something very valuable for the journal and for the field. And we know you need a quick turnaround. So I have some of the fastest turnaround in the entire field of cardiology. Papers come and you get a decision extremely rapidly. And we try to be respectful for your efforts. And then if you have a good idea, we try to work with you. But what do we expect from the authors, right? We want something that answers an important question, right? It has to have strong methodology. It has to be plausible. And you need to disclose all the other form frustrates of that paper that are floating around. We don't really like a paper to be chopped up into salami slices. And then you should have to be willing to work with us if it's a good idea. So the general thing that scares the authors is that they think the reviewer and the review process is a gatekeeper, right? Our job is to reject, but that's not true, right? So although it feels like that, it feels to me also when I'm an author and get a rejection. But in Jack Imaging, actually, we work as a facilitator, and I'll show you some data showing that we overrule reviewers all the time if we think it is not a fair review. So what are the pro-author features in Jack Imaging? I already covered that. So I have increased the content 80% more in original research, 100% more in original research, 80% more in total content. The acceptance rates, I brought it to 8% from about 5.5% when I took over. I'm happy to say about 70% of the top 100 imaging papers come in Jack Imaging. And then unlike other journals who have societies backing them, we don't have any guidelines. We don't have any imaging societies. Each imaging society will publish in their own journal, so I don't have access to any guidelines. Nevertheless, so 90% of my citations come from original research, less than 8% come from reviews. So this is a home for pure science. So if you have good scientific ideas, this is a home. Okay, so what are the best practices and some useful tips? So what's an author up against? So as we said, they are up against a acceptance rate of about 6% at Jack, 6 to 8% at Jack Imaging. So a lot of good papers are going to be rejected. Like I said, we get about 40 papers a week. And a lot of them are very good papers. And so essentially we have to, each week, we spend 2.5 hours looking at the prospective papers that go. I have 15 associate editors over 4 continents. We all log into an online meeting for 2.5 hours and discuss every paper thoroughly. Every paper that has a potential value and a chance of getting accepted. So what do I look for, or what does my journal look for? We basically look for quality, an important question. It has to be replicable. It has to be generalizable. So these are the usual things that all of you know. But what we pay a lot of attention is whether it's advancing the field and whether it changes practice. So the 2 bottom line strategy, does it change strategy of how we manage patients, and does it change outcome? If you fill either of these boxes and your work is robustly done, you have a very, very high chance of getting an acceptance. You may have to work once or twice in the revision process. Nothing gets accepted in the first go anyway, but there's a good chance that you would get accepted. Okay, you might always ask this question: how good are editors at predicting something is valuable or not valuable? So we can use the same metrics like any other test, and this is the metrics in my journal, and we looked at our whole year's worth of acceptances. The columns on the left tell you what is the concordance between two reviewers and the editors. So if you look at here, when the reviewers recommended acceptance, we only agreed with them 84% of the times. The editorial board vetoed that decision in about 16% of the time. When the reviewers recommended rejection, we agreed with them only 72% of the time. So which means, as an author, this should kind of make you feel warm and fuzzy, that the editor is batting for you, and we are willing to overturn a decision from now, mind you, these reviewers are very well qualified. So for example, the process in JACC imaging is papers come, I look at every paper, then depending upon how likely it is that it's going to go through a revision process successfully, we make a decision, and about 40% of the papers are rejected without review. Among the papers that go out for review, I then send it to an associate editor. Just I said, like, we have 15 associate editors spanning echo, MR, CT, nuclear, intravascular, and prevention. These are broken up into these categories, and it goes to one of the associate. We have associate editors in Australia, Asia, Europe, Canada, and of course the United States. So it goes to them, they send it to 2 reviews, 2 are the minimum for our journal. It's extremely rare that we get a 3rd reviewer, because we think within these 15 associate editors, we have sufficient firepower to make a decision based on 2 reviewers. Just to give you a flavor of the current editorial board at JACC Imaging, we have 6 past presidents of societies. They are either ECHO, past president of ASC, or SCMR, or SCCT, or ASNAC. So really, really impactful people, and who have done a lot of work. And so within our group, we are able to come up with a decision. Of the decisions where we say, let's keep it in play, about 60% of them get a de novo decision, where we say there is potential here, but come back with more data, or come back with major changes. The remaining 40% or so get major revision change, which means you have a very high likelihood of making it, but you have to address some of the things that they have asked. The chance of getting an acceptance on a major revision is pretty high. So if you get a major revision decision, often you just have one more revision to do, and you get it maybe 80% of the times you are in. If you get a de novo, it's not as strong. You have about 40% chance of making it. With 1 revision, you have about 70% chance of making it with 2 revisions. So if you get a de novo decision, you still are in a very good position to make it. It means that it's gone through a lot of filters already. All you have to do is just work with the reviewers and the editors. So we discuss all these papers Thursday afternoon for about 2.5 hours. So there are people who are at 5 a.m. in Australia and 10:30 p.m. in Europe. But everybody is awake and participating in the discussion. And although you can hear somebody munching in the back, probably it's breakfast time or dinner time or past dinner. What about our sensitivity and specificity? So sensitivity here is predicting papers that are likely to be valued in the field. So we look at what happened in the next 2 years with that paper and see how accurate we are. So we are about 80% accurate in predicting papers that would do well. And our specificity about identifying signs that will not move the field forward is much higher than our ability to predict papers that will do well. So essentially, this is, if you like, say you take nuclear imaging or you do a stress perfusion imaging, these would be the numbers. So it's not perfect, but it's passable, it's workable. We are trying hard to make this better, but there's no good way of doing it because there's a lot of subjective part involved in this. The other thing you need to do is you need to understand the journal, right? So this was a paper we published at the start of the early years of JAK imaging. So what are the papers and how do they add value? And so the highest value obviously is something that has patient care impact, right? And of course, game-changing ideas are very few. And if they are game-changing ideas, they'll probably be in New England Journal of Medicine or somewhere else. I mean, I wouldn't be so a person with lack of insight to think that will come in my journal. But they end up in our journal. So for example, you probably heard of that concept where Paul Graben and Milton Packer wrote that proportionate and disproportionate mitral regurgitation. You remember there was that controversy whether why COAPT worked and MITRA-FR didn't work for secondary mitral regurgitation and clipping the mitral valve. So there was always this controversy, does it work or not work? And so Paul Graben went back and looked at his data and looked at the Garlin concepts of how to measure regurgitation, and came back and showed in a very nice paper 3 years ago that normalizing the mitral regurgitation in secondary MR to the size of the LV is a good predictor of why COAPT worked and MITRA-FR trial, which was equally big trial, didn't work. These are randomized trials. And so he came up with this concept of proportionate and disproportionate MR, that if the LV dilates proportionate to the severity of MR, you don't do well with TR. But if the MR is disproportionate to the size of the LV, I mean, these are concepts we've been talking about for a long time, but I commissioned this paper from Paul, and I said, look at your data. And so he published it, and it's the highest cited paper in imaging, period. So we do get some very good papers, but those are few. A lot of papers are working in this area, and the lower you go in this system, the less likely chance that you will get a paper accepted in JAK imaging. And we don't do case reports at all. So this gives you a sense of what we think is valuable. And then, of course, periodically we publish what's on the editor's mind, and that gives you a sense of what is the kind of papers that we are trying to look at for our journal. So we talked briefly about the journal mechanics, right? So JAK gets about 400 to 500 papers per month, and then imaging gets half of that. I already told you. This is important. So we discuss on an average about 10 minutes per paper on our editorial board calls. And so it just works like the NIH study section, where one associate editor takes responsibility for the paper, presents what he thinks is the background and importance of that paper. Then he gives a summary of the associate editors, of the reviewers' comments. All the 15 associate editors have already looked at this. The agenda has gone out before. And then we chat about it and put it through the usual metrics of what we think is a good paper. And the reason to bring this out is that it's a very finite window for you to make your case, right? So if the tighter your paper is, the clearer it is, the methods are clear, and you had some independent people look at it and improve it, the higher the chance that it will make it. So you essentially have to think how you will stand out in the crowd. And I'll give you a tip of what I think makes this much easier than we think it is. Then you have to understand peer review, right? It's a painful and capricious system, but it's the best we have. And this is a thing I created long time ago. Suppose God had submitted a paper to one of the top journals, right? I'm sure they would take him through 2 or 3 revisions and say he sent something about creating life, right? So he might have got a letter like this. How do we know life would not have happened without you, right? You need better controls. The fact that you did it a few billion times since then doesn't matter. It was not randomized. Might be subject to selection bias. And then we finally didn't know what life is supposed to achieve. So we don't know the long term. So this is just in jest. I created this when I presented this once about 5-6 years ago. Howard Wagner was the editor-in-chief of JAMA. He said that he liked it so much. He says, "Can I borrow this? I'm going to put it in JAMA, and I'm going to credit you." But this is true. Sometimes as an author, you feel like this. You just can't win. But you can help the editor help you, right? So here is some of the things that we often neglect. One of the strongest things and one of the things that is the most underused is a strong cover letter. So as I said, I look at the paper myself, I look at the cover letter, the associate editor looks at the paper, he looks at the cover letter. That is your chance to get the editor and the editorial board's attention in one paragraph, right? Instead of the whole manuscript where it gets diluted in many other things, just in your cover letter tell us, I think this paper is important because 1, 2, 3, right? And this has not been done, this has been done but done weakly or something, and this is how this is going to change the field. Just one paragraph, even bullet points. So that is very important for you to, and you will see so many times they would say, "Dear editor, it's a pleasure to submit this. Please review. Thank you." I mean, so that you have lost an opportunity where you know that somebody is going to look at these points. So that's very important. Then the other thing you need to do is thoughtful revisions. You will not believe the number of times the authors pick up a fight with the reviewers, right? I mean, the reviewer may be wrong, you may have very low opinion of the reviewers, but they are experts in the field. So none of our reviews are just fellows who have graduated. These are people who have contributed a lot in their life. So even if you think they are wrong, you need to be very thoughtful in your revisions and respectful. Then another important thing, especially when it comes from multi-author groups, is the senior authors have to put in sweat equity in it. I mean, if they just sign on, okay, put my name in, looks good, often you'll be surprised at how easy this is to find out. So when we are looking at papers, and the commonest complaint we see is, looks like the senior person did not read this paper, right? And you can easily tell whether it's written by a fellow or whether it's written by somebody who has experience here. And then, of course, you have salami science and connect with questions. In the last year or two, your colleagues have been very good in connecting with questions. What I mean is you should reach out to the editor, right? You should reach out to the associate editor and say, I got this review from you and we got rejected and all. Can I talk to you and explain to you why you guys are wrong or why you should take a second look or something? And there are at least 2 of your colleagues who are very good at that, and they have my number on speed dial. And I know when I send a rejection letter to them, I'm going to get a call. So, I mean, you have to use it in moderation, but it's a good technique. So, because you can get just like NIH grant, right? You have a program officer, you'll reach out to them and say, hey, tell me exactly what was the board thinking? Why did they think this was bad? And at least in my journal, many journals will not entertain that, but in my journal, we entertain that all the time. So feel free to reach out, and absolutely. Okay, responding to reviewers. Now, this is an important thing. We all know that peer review is terrible. This is Richard Horton. He is the editor-in-chief of The Lancet, one of the most powerful journals in the world. And this is what he thinks about peer review, right? He says we think of it as a quasi-sacred process. It's the most objective truth teller, but we know it's biased, unjust, unaccountable, incomplete, often insulting, usually ignorant, occasionally foolish, and frequently wrong. I mean, he has a point there, right? Because these are independent people who are going to review. Who knows what biases they have? Who knows they had a fight with their wife or their kid who's been misbehaving, they are in a bad mood, how they review. We expect them not to let these things influence, but who knows, right? I mean, so there is always an element of capriciousness here, and that's where my responsibility and my editorial board responsibility, and that's why you saw a lot of times when 72% of the times when they recommended rejection, we accepted, the other proportion we did not. So we try to play a moderating influence there, but peer review is tricky. So there are some terms that you need to know, right? So reject without review, the shorthand is don't even think about us again, right? So you don't have to bother. But for some accept with revisions, it means you have a great chance and please make it right and we would like your paper. And then de novo, these are the two groups that you want to really concentrate on. These are the author phenotypes we have seen at JACC Imaging. There are the immovable authors who says the reviewers and editors are ignorant, you should publish my paper. So the chance of you getting accepted is very low. Here is the chances of you getting accepted. Your highest chance is if you work with the reviewers. Even if you don't like it, work with them, and if you disagree, you can defend your things. So the important thing is to remember reviewers are neither stupid nor your enemy, right? So you just address their consent by point to point, and if you disagree, tell us respectfully. This is very important, right? You need to have outcome data that makes your paper strong or supporting citations. If you have something to defend your point of view, do that. And then, of course, you don't want to guess who is reviewing your paper and try to tailor it accordingly. That doesn't work. Okay, last thing, handling disappointment. All of us get lots of, in fact, we get majority of our decision letters as authors we have all faced is rejection, right? Acceptance is a small part, rejection. So it's natural to feel hurt, but what is important is to look at the rejection letter. Was it a wrong journal? Was it that they said there was no novelty or they had inadequate data, come back with data? It's very important to read the decision letter carefully. We take a lot of time in writing decision letters. In fact, I have a whole group of people who look at these letters, and what comes out in a decision letter has a lot of value. So just look at it and see what you think is happening there. What is it that the editor is identifying as wrong? And never respond immediately or fire off an email, because we see sometimes that happens and it doesn't help. And while you're waiting to respond, it's always good to get a second opinion from another person not involved in your research, and they can say, yeah, it doesn't look as good as you think it is, or it's better than what you think it is, and you should shape it this way or that way. And then this is very important, right? You just make, every decision letter is accompanied by a lot of critiques, right? So make it into 3 piles, right? What you can fix, what you cannot fix, and what you cannot fix, find a way to defend that and say, I cannot do this extra experiment because of this, or I don't think we need to think about this hypothesis because XYZ showed that it doesn't work, or whatever. You can use that. And you are absolutely free to disagree, right? You just have to defend yourself with evidence. And we really don't worry about authors challenging us. That's the nature of science, right? But you just have to come back with evidence and say, this is the reason. Sharkey et al. Showed that Takotsubo happens like this, right? And or whatever. So just do that. And you have to keep emotions out of rebuttal letters. And this happens even with very senior people. I recently got a letter from a very, very senior investigator who is like a legend in cardiology. He didn't like our rejection letter, and he sent me a bibliography of his CV and say, look what I have published in cardiology. It's in the sense, how dare you reject my letter? It's not a personal decision. It is just based on this particular work didn't fit my journal at this moment in time. So it's not like we are making any decisions on their personal worth. It is just we are critiquing the work. Okay, I think, so I'll end here. So it's like a crowded field, right? There's an editor and an author, and we have to find each other. I mean, without good authors, the editor is not going to be very effective. And without a good platform, authors are not going to be effective. So I'll kind of conclude early so that we'll have some time for questions. Thank you.
Thanks for a great talk. I don't know that we've met. My name is Steve Bradley. I'm one of the associate editors at JAMA Network Open.
Steve, yeah, I think we met at the VA. You visited there a couple of times, right?
I have in the past, yep.
Yep.
I was particularly curious about the slide you showed about agreement, disagreement with your reviewers and sensitivity and specificity, because I'm hoping to better understand that a little bit better. You have two reviewers, and you talked about discordance. What was the threshold of discordance? Was it when both reviewers said accept and you said we disagree, or both reviewers? Okay.
Right. When both reviewers said accept and we disagreed, or it went to a third reviewer and the majority said accept.
Okay. And then the other question was about the sensitivity and specificity about impactful work. Was that looking at papers that you all had rejected to try and understand where else they went and what happened?
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Thank you.
That, as you can imagine, would be a lot of work, right? We had one of the young students look at where the papers went afterwards in the next 2 years.
A lot is changing and evolving in publishing world, and I'm curious about your thoughts about preprints, its impact, what impact factors are going to look like in the COVID era where things have gone absolutely insane, and so what that will mean for understanding impact factors for the next couple of years. I feel like there was another question I had, but I've forgotten. We'll hear that.
Right. So let's start with the preprint first, and then we'll go to the COVID impact factors. So when Jack was looking at this, there was a strong resistance to allow papers that were already in preprint to come into the Jack family. If you look at this 5 years ago, we would not have taken a paper that was on preprint into the journal. And the idea there was the Ingle-Fingle rule, right? That like this is like already exposed and it's published, so we wouldn't take it. We had a lot of debate, and I was particularly vocal in saying we should take papers which were out there in preprint, and we changed our policy. So 5 years ago, we said now it's okay, you can put it on preprint. There were some mechanics issues, right? Like which becomes the article of record, right? And what if the preprint differs significantly from the final product after the reviews and all that? So there were some things we had to do, and ultimately we figured out a way for the last DOI to come into the journal, and that becomes the article of record. So we did that. There is still a lot of regret and anguish about that, especially in the medical field. Unlike physics, where preprints are huge, there's always this thing that ABC or CNN will pick up a preprint and say chloroquine works in COVID, and then you know that's going to be a disaster, and there's no way you can stop that. So that's lot of my colleagues among the editor-in-chiefs have that reservation. But the way I look at it is, or some of us look at it, is preprint is like an abstract presentation at a meeting, right? So you presented, you got advice, you improved your paper, and then you sent it to a journal. Then you shorten the journey. One of the problems in publishing is the time it takes. Say, suppose you submit a paper to a journal, it takes 9 months before it gets published, right? So the preprints, if they have already improved things and they got advice from others based on a preprint, that could shorten the journey. So there is still a lot of mixed feelings, but I think that horse is out of the barn. So now a journal which doesn't take preprint is missing out. The impact factors in the COVID era, I don't know how that is going to change. Some journals are going to see a big decline. Part of that is how journals handled the COVID. So we as a policy, at least in JAC Imaging, decided we will not publish any COVID papers unless they are absolutely outstanding. So all through the COVID period, 2 years, I only published 4 papers on COVID. 3 original full papers and 1 letter. And you can see how the world is all topsy-turvy. The one I published as a letter got the widest press, and it was on CNN. So we decided not to publish COVID, and we lost out in some sense, right? But I think we did the right thing. So my impact factor is not going to be affected too much by COVID paper. Unlike some other journals where COVID was their predominant source of impact, you will be surprised that the top COVID paper has 14,000 citations and an altmetric score of 32,000. It's unheard of. I mean, an altmetric score of 50 takes you into stratosphere. You should say, wow, this has got a lot of buzz. But the COVID paper is huge. There's a case report in JAMA Cardiology by a guy called Inciardi from Italy. Single case report, myocarditis due to COVID. Today we think that it's a non-issue, right? This has 1,000 citations. And this is going to improve the journal's impact factor by, I think, 4 points or 5 points. So if the editor decided I'm not going to publish 50 other papers and just publish this, his impact factor still would be high. So COVID really made the publishing and scientific scholarly publishing world really bizarre. And you're right. I mean, the next 2 years you'll have some shakedown of all those who got the COVID bump may not be in the same. The tragedy there is, like, it's the, what's that called? The Matthew effect, right? So like if you have more, you get more, right? So in the same sense, if you get a temporary boost with COVID and now your impact factor is 29, and suddenly everybody will think you are a good journal and they'll start sending you more and more papers. And then even if you become hollow later on, you still have that jet stream that's propelling. So it's been a big turbulence in the publishing world. Do you see that in your area also?
Oh, absolutely. We have a similar, I can't give you the specifics, but a letter that's been cited an astronomical number of times. So yes.
Yeah, I mean Santiago's MI paper, right? That was the letter, correct or no? The first one, the Jack one. Yeah. That did beautifully well.
Great talk. How are associate editors identified, and is there a term length, or is it on an annual basis?
Yeah. So good question. So the Jack family generally appointed associate editors based on what the editor-in-chief thought would be a good panel. So they give the editor-in-chief full unrestricted access to choose what they want. And so I built my panel based on what I thought would be areas where I need strength and where I need more expertise. One advantage I had was that I am familiar with all the 4 or 5 modalities, so I have a reasonable grasp of that. So I could kind of see where I need help. That's how we picked up. One of my younger colleagues in JAC Cardio-Oncology, the editor-in-chief of that journal is going a different way. She is going to advertise and ask for people to apply to be associate editor. I don't know whether that experiment will work or not, because there's also a chemistry you need. You don't need, just like the NIH study sections, you don't need a person who on the associate editor committee or editorial board who keeps fighting all the time or rejecting things all the time. That will vitiate every atmosphere. So I think I will probably do that, just stay with the way I am handling. One of the things, now this is still not public knowledge, but one of the things that I'm going to start, I just got renewed for my 2nd term. So I finished 5 years and now I have another 5-year term. And so when my next 5-year term starts in June, I'm thinking of creating a assistant editor position, which is like building up my own team and start grooming mid-level or early to mid-level people who are interested in publishing to join and then grow into an associate editor position. Let me see how far that will go, because that would be a good way for younger people to get entry into this panel.
That was really an exceptional talk, and I think all cardiology fellows in the US and probably in Europe as well should hear it. It's really helpful. I wonder what's your experience with having to redact papers? Is that a big issue at your journal, and how do you handle that?
Right, and that's a nightmare scenario for every editor-in-chief. Luckily, we didn't have to retract anything, but it's just a matter of time. So, like, science is so much based on trust, right? So, we know the literature, we can pick up big deficiencies, but you can't pick up something where data is cooked, right? So you can't. So it's becoming easier in molecular biology and things like that, where you probably heard about this lady, very famous lady, Elizabeth Bix. She's made it her life's mission to go and track images of, say, Western blots or any of those gels where these are duplicated or these are photoshopped or these are worked upon, and she has an electronic way of doing that. We don't have anything like that in content, right? Because we don't publish those kind of things. And it scares me because the future of imaging is going to be much more difficult, because at least my area is all based on images, right? Patterns, pattern recognition. And once deep fakes come into this, right, you could create pretty much source images which never existed, right? You could create a CT scan which never existed. You could create an MR image which never existed. And so those will be undetectable. It gets even worse. There's a paper from an Israeli group in one of these science publications where they put a diverter in the CT scan room. So the machine is sending the CT scan to your workstation, right? They put a little diverter and diverted a copy of the scans to a separate workstation. They used CNN, convolutional neural networks, to alter these were chest CT scans. They altered it and put lesions into the lung parenchyma and then sent it back to the PACS. They had a secret code to say which is a doctored study and which is a regular study. And among senior radiologists looking at this, there were at least, I think, 20% of the cases where they said this guy needs surgery because this lung cancer is sufficiently advanced. There was no lung cancer in the original scan. So this was all a artificial intelligence mediated scan. And so they just put it in and then sent it back and tried to see what happens downstream. So you can imagine that tomorrow, say, somebody decides to create this kind of data, and if you ask them to provide original data, they'll provide you original data, which will all be fake. So these kind of things are going to affect imaging significantly as we go forward.
So we do have a couple online questions. First of all, thank you very much for that excellent talk. The first one is, thank you for the great informative talk. Is there any hope that journals will collaborate to have a common process of article submission? This question goes on to say, the most time-consuming process for the author is revising for nuanced journal requirements. Wouldn't it be great to have a common process wherein the author can transition to an alternative journal in the same family seamlessly? Perhaps imaging journals could lead the charge.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question, but as you would probably expect, we all have thought about this, and there are reasons why it will work and not work. At least in the JACC family of journals, you can transfer from one journal, say something goes to JACC and JACC says, this won't fit us, send it to intervention. You can send it to intervention without any remodification, and the reviews go to the new journal, and then they can decide based on that. So within the family, it's pretty seamless, and that's possible. Between the families is a little more tricky. So when I took over 2016, one of the first things I did at the ACC that year was I met the editor-in-chiefs of all the other imaging journals. And my naive idea was my journal is modality agnostic, right? So I don't particularly promote echo or nuclear or CT or MR. So I thought I may be the most non-threatening person in the room. And I said, I'm happy to collaborate with other journals and say, if I have a paper which we can't use, can I find a mechanism for me to pass it on to, say, the Echo or the Nuclear Journal and say, guys, do you want to take a look at this? But very soon I realized that there are lots of things that come into this. For example, societies want to be exclusive. They don't want, there are legal issues of transferring intellectual property without the author's permission, and then the platforms are different. We use a different publication, manuscript handling platform, somebody uses different. And one thing I heard from one particular association, which I'm still surprised that I heard that, they said, we don't want to be seen as a subordinate journal to Jack Image, which to me was a complete surprise. Because if I was a journal editor-in-chief and I'm getting access to papers which I normally would not have, I would give an arm and a leg to get that, right? So there are lots of human and beyond human issues which affect this, and surprisingly that hasn't, or not surprisingly, that hasn't taken off.
Yeah, thank you very much for that response. So there's one final online question, and the question is about the economics of journals. So the question is, can you comment on the economics of academic publishing, in particular the long uncompensated hours supplied by physicians as writers and reviewers on behalf of multi-million or even billion-dollar publishers that own the journals?
You are absolutely right. That is the billion-dollar question. You'll be surprised, this publication model comes from one of the pioneers on building empires and fortunes, Howard Hughes. He started this whole process, who knows, early 20th century, where he realized a lot of academics have talent and they have material which nobody is sourcing, and he got it from them for free, and say, okay, I'll expose what you did, I'll kind of publish it, and I'll showcase it, and all the scientists say, sure, here, take it. And so this is the only model where we produce the intellectual property, we give it to somebody free. Actually, we pay them to review our papers now, right? There are APC charges. Then we give it to them, and then they hold a lot of economic derived value from them. So there's no other model like this. You're right. That economics. There's a thing called Plan S. I don't know if you guys have heard about this. They started in Europe, where a lot of libraries kind of started grouping together and said, once a paper is published, it has to be free and knowledge has to spread unobstructed with firewalls or economics. So that's gaining a lot of momentum, and a lot of big publishers are kind of starting to work with the Plan S people. The economics will change, but I don't see a lot of voluntary effort going away. There are some journals which pay the reviewers, but those are generally not thought to be the higher quality ones. So for now, the content will become more free, but I think the review process and the generation of the original paper will still remain like a voluntary effort.
Thank you.